The Transcontinental Railroad, 1869. Dawn came slowly to the work camps, spreading pale light across canvas tents and stacks of wooden ties. Coffee simmered over small fires while men laced boots and rubbed cold from their fingers. The sound that followed was steady and familiar, the bright ring of hammer on spike, a rhythm that carried across open land like a simple song. In the years after the Civil War, the nation longed for connection and speed. A single railroad to bridge the continent had been the hope of planners, merchants, and families for a long time. Now, with patient hands and careful plans, the Union Pacific laid rails west from Omaha and the Central Pacific climbed east out of Sacramento. Between them stretched prairies, deserts, and mountains that would ask for steady work and quiet courage every day. The idea of binding the country with rails was easy to explain and hard to achieve. Congress promised loans and land for each mile completed, and surveyors traced lines across maps with calm certainty that the land itself would later test. Engineers studied grades, bridges, and curves. The telegraph would follow the rails so that messages could move as quickly as trains. But none of it would matter without the hands that lifted rails, set ties, and turned wrenches. Those hands came from many places: farms in the Midwest, towns along the Atlantic coast, villages in Ireland and southern China. Each morning they met the same task: advance the line a little farther, and each evening they measured progress not in speeches but in the short, shining length of new track that lay straight behind them. The Central Pacific faced the Sierra Nevada first. Granite rose ahead like a calm, silent wall. The company hired thousands of Chinese workers, careful, disciplined crews who cooked rice and vegetables in neat camps, saved their pay when they could, and sent money home. They kept their quarters clean and ordered. They strung bold blue jackets to dry in the thin mountain sun. In summer they worked in hot dust. In winter they fought storms that buried camps and tracks under drifts as high as houses. Sometimes they dug tunnels through snow just to reach the day's work. At steep slopes, they cut shelves into the mountain itself and built wooden sheds over the track so avalanches would pass above. The sheds were dark and smoky inside, but they kept trains alive in seasons that would otherwise have closed the line. Tunneling through the Sierra demanded a different kind of endurance. Granite yields slowly to hand and steel. Crews drilled by candle and lamplight, using star drills turned a finger's width between hammer blows. Black powder split seams a few feet at a time. Later, in strict cold and with precise handling, nitroglycerin sped the work but heightened the danger. The summit tunnel near Donner Pass consumed more than a year, inch by inch, while other crews carved ledges along cliffs to carry the roadbed forward. The sound in those tunnels was a small, bright world of its own: steel tapping steel, a foreman's short word, a fuse's hiss, and then a deep breath as dust settled. Outside, the mountain waited without hurry. Inside, men found the patience to match it. The Union Pacific's challenge was different. The plains between the Missouri and the Rockies unfolded wide and mostly gentle, but distance itself became the test. Rails, spikes, food, and water had to keep pace with a front that moved every day. Herds of buffalo crossed the grade in slow, rolling rivers of dark backs and curved horns. Riders from nearby forts and native nations passed with news, caution, or trade. The railroad's line entered lands where tribes had traveled for generations. Some leaders allowed the track to pass with conditions and supplies, others looked at the fast-moving grade and saw trouble coming. The open country carried voices a long way, and the conversations were not simple. Irish immigrants, freedmen, Civil War veterans, and local hands filled Union Pacific crews. They lived in rolling camp towns that rose at the railhead and fell quiet when the track moved on. People called those towns Hell on Wheels, and the name fit on some nights. Yet even there were simple routines that made a place feel human: a cook who learned everyone's favorite stew, a tent where stitches were traded for stories, a mail wagon that brought letters sweating with the heat of a far pocket. A good foreman kept tempers cool and eyes on safety. A bad one made the air around a job feel thin. By sundown, everyone knew which kind they had. A mile of track began with a grade, earth-shaped to a gentle profile, packed firm and crowned so rain would run off. Ties came next, trimmed to length and laid at even spacing by men with practiced eyes. Iron rails, 30 feet long and heavy, were lifted with tongs and swung into place. Spikes were set, 2 on a side, and driven with clean, ringing blows. Gaugers checked the distance between rails with a simple bar. Ballast crews spread gravel with shovels and tamped it tight. Beside them a water wagon waited, and a blacksmith kept a small forge hot to bend, straighten, and mend what the day cracked. A single whistle from the engine said the line was ready to stretch forward again. Supply was a puzzle solved one day at a time. The Central Pacific's iron crossed oceans around Cape Horn or through the Isthmus, then traveled up the Pacific to San Francisco and Sacramento. The Union Pacific's iron rolled west from eastern mills on earlier rails and riverboats. Along with iron came hammers, spikes, stoves, tents, boots, and barrels of salt pork. Quartermasters tracked it all in ledgers with narrow columns: received, issued, on hand. A delay at a dock, a storm at sea, or a broken wagon axle could stall a week's work. The people who kept those ledgers and lists were not famous, but a steady pencil often saved a season. Money shaped choices as surely as mountains and rivers. Government loans were paid out by the mile, with higher amounts for harder ground. That promise pulled the grade forward like a rope. On the prairie, the Union Pacific sometimes laid track in wide arcs to gain miles quickly, then returned later to ease curves and fix soft spots. In the Sierra, the Central Pacific advanced methodically because stone would not be hurried. Inspectors measured and reported, banks released funds, and payrolls reached camps by guarded wagons. It was simple on paper and complicated in practice, which is to say it was like most human work worth doing. Winter in the mountains wrote its own rules. Snow drifted across cuts and filled them like bathtubs. Crews strung lines between buildings so men could find their way when wind erased the world. Avalanche watch was part of every day. When slides came, men dug with shovels and hands until they reached the track or the people pinned beneath it. Sheds guarded the line where slopes were worst. Inside those long wooden halls, engines passed with muffled thunder, steam blooming against the roof and curling down like breath. Smoke stung eyes, but the trains kept moving. That was the promise, and crews kept it. Locomotives powered everything. Firemen fed wood or coal into the firebox and watched the flames color for heat. Engineers kept a hand on the throttle and an eye on the pressure gauge. The boiler's breath was steady when the grade was right and labored when it steepened. The whistle spoke in clear, simple language, short for forward, long for crossings, urgent when trouble showed ahead. A water stop could calm a whole crew. Men took turns at the spout, washed dust from their faces, and laughed at jokes that were never new and always needed. Telegraph wires followed the rails and made the railroad feel like a single living thing. In small stations, operators listened to clicks that spelled out orders and news. A sheet of paper on a hook held the most recent message, next to it sat a pot of ink and a careful pen. An operator might send a single word that ran the length of the continent in a breath, then lean back with relief as the answer returned. The wire did not sleep. At night it hummed faintly in the dry air as if it were remembering the day. Workers built communities as they built the line. Chinese crews organized themselves into teams with cooks, water carriers, and leaders who watched for safety. They bought their own food and prepared meals that tasted like home: rice, vegetables, dried fish, tea. They kept camps tidy, scraped paths clear, and bathed even in cold weather when a bucket of water could make a man gasp. They often took the most dangerous jobs and still kept a calm order that saved lives. When pay was short or conditions unfair, they protested in quiet unity until matters improved. Their patience and skill were engines as important as any boiler. On the Union Pacific, Irish ballads set the pace for swinging hammers. Freedmen earned steady wages and learned new trades. Veterans taught drill that kept a gang moving as one. Carpenters cut trestle parts with quick accuracy. Cooks kept kettles full. A wagon called the hospital carried bandages, carbolic, and a surgeon's kit. Everyone hoped it would rattle along empty. Sundays brought a little rest. Some men played cards. Some wrote letters. Some simply slept until the sun stood high and the whistle called them back to work. As the years turned, the gap between the companies narrowed. Surveyors from both sides finally climbed the same ridges and pointed to the same pass. The meeting would be at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, a broad saddle where the land itself seemed to invite a handshake. In early May 1869, 2 locomotives approached along brand-new track, the Central Pacific's Bright Jupiter from the west and the Union Pacific's sturdy No. 119 from the east. Track was dressed smooth, joins tightened, and ballast raked so the line would look as steady as it felt. The day of the ceremony was clear and mild. Speeches were brief. A telegraph key waited near the rail so the country could hear in real time. Spikes were set, 2 ceremonial ones, one of gold and one of silver, along with the ordinary iron that would truly hold. Leland Stanford and Thomas Durant lifted mauls. When the hammers fell, the operator tapped a single word into the wire, "Done," and bells rang in city halls across the nation. Cannons answered in some places. In others, people simply looked up from their work, smiled at one another, and nodded, as if to say, "Yes, now we are connected." After the cheers faded, quieter benefits arrived. Mail that had once taken weeks by stage now crossed the country in days. Newspapers from the Atlantic coast reached San Francisco before their ink had fully dried. Families traveling west could measure their journey in schedules instead of seasons. A trip that had risked months of dust and illness by wagon or a long, dangerous voyage by sea now fit inside a single week of careful timetables and warm meals taken at station hotels. People stepped aboard as strangers and stepped off knowing one another's names. Freight moved in new ways too. Wheat, wool, timber, and/or filled cars and rolled to market with a certainty that changed towns. Merchants ordered cloth and tools with confidence. A piano could ride to a parlor in a valley where only a fiddle had played before. A family could send for a cast iron stove and cook winter meals on it before the first snow arrived. The railroad did not make life easy, but it made planning possible. That simple change made many other things grow. Not every change was gentle. The rails crossed lands central to many native nations, and the speed of settlement pressed hard against people who had lived on those plains and in those mountains for generations. Buffalo herds thinned until they were a memory in many places. Promises made in treaties were ignored or rewritten. Some leaders tried to shape agreements that would protect families and traditions, others met force with force. The railroad was part of a story of quick movement and hard choices. It tied coasts together and, at the same time, pulled at communities already tied to the land. The work itself left marks that careful eyes can still find. Snow sheds darkened and were rebuilt. Tunnels exhaled cool air on hot days. Culverts whispered under ballast after rain. Section houses stood every few miles with a small garden, a rack for tools, and a porch where boots could be scraped clean. Section crews walked their stretches, tightening bolts, replacing cracked ties, and listening for the small click that warned of a loose fish plate. Their work rarely made the papers. It made the trains arrive safely. Timekeeping changed to meet the trains. For years each town kept its own noon, set by the sun. That worked when travel was slow. Railroads, however, needed clocks that agreed. Dispatchers began to use broad time zones along the line, and in 1883 nearly all the railroads in the country adopted 4 standard zones at once. People reset watches in depots while agents posted new timetables. Later the government followed their lead. The rails did not only carry goods and people, they taught the nation how to share a clock. The golden spike moment did not end the work. Crews eased grades that had proved too steep, straightened curves that pinched, and replaced timber bridges with iron. Branch lines reached north and south to mines, farms, and ports. Shops grew at division points where locomotives could be repaired and overhauled. Water towers lifted wooden spouts over tracks, and coaling docks rose like blunt towers. Roundhouses turned engines to face new directions. Stations became hearts of towns where families waited with flowers and nervous smiles. People who had built the line kept small keepsakes that outlasted contracts and pay stubs. A granite driller leaned his last bit behind the door at home and touched it like a handshake when he came in from the rain. A cook passed down a recipe for stew thickened with flour, beans, or biscuit crumbs depending on what the wagon brought that week. A surveyor kept the brass compass that had helped choose a pass, its lid polished by a thumb. A Chinese carpenter saved a wooden plane and a chisel worn smooth at the handle and set them on a shelf above the hearth. These were not trophies. They were reminders of days met with steady hands. Station towns learned new habits. When a telegraph operator tapped out a delay, the cafe watered coffee and kept soup warm. The blacksmith built a rack for coupling pins beside the horseshoes. The school teacher unpacked a crate of readers shipped from the east and started a library in a corner of the classroom. The doctor met a box of new instruments off the evening train and slept easier. Ordinary improvements gathered like small stones building a firm path. With the trains came rules written in plainer words. Tickets needed clear terms. Freight needed fair rates. Cars needed couplers and brakes that would not fail in a panic. Courts and regulators listened to complaints and set standards. Railroads answered with safer hardware and steadier procedures, automatic couplers, air brakes, signal systems with colors and positions no one could mistake. No change erased risk. Together they lowered it until long journeys felt normal instead of brave. If you want to ride the whole story in your mind, start in a Sacramento yard where fresh ties smell of sap and sawdust. Follow the grade into the foothills, where oaks give way to tall pines and the air cools with each step. Step inside a tunnel where the rock holds a memory of powder and sweat. Emerge to a lake that looks like a piece of sky laid carefully among ridges. Drift east to the open prairie, where grass rolls like an inland sea and the rails draw a clean, bright line. Cross a timber trestle where water talks under your feet. Watch a train arrive at a small station and leave a minute later, right on time, as if the whole country had taken one breath together. Let the meeting be calm. Watch the men lower their hammers. See a crewman wipe his hands on a rag and look down the rails, already thinking about tomorrow's tightening of bolts and dressing of ballast. A photographer steps back from his camera and asks the crowd to hold still. The telegraph key clicks a short message. In distant towns, people pause and listen. A smile moves across a street like sunlight across a fence. The country is not finished, but it feels connected in a new way. The Transcontinental Railroad did not solve every problem or heal every wound. It did not make every bargain fair or every schedule kind. It did something steadier. It gave the nation a reliable way to move, to trade, and to visit. It shrank distances without shrinking people's hopes. It asked strangers to trust timetables and one another. It taught families to think across mountains and deserts, and it made room for stories to travel as quickly as letters. Along its length, the land kept its voice, the high hush of snow, the wide quiet of grass, the clean ring of a hammer, reminding everyone that speed and care must live together. Imagine a night train after the celebration has ended. In a sleeping car, a lamp glows behind a shade. Someone reads a last page and closes a book. Someone ties back a curtain and looks out at stars. In the baggage car, a trunk taps softly against a strap at each rail joint. In the coach, a baby sleeps on a shoulder while an older man nods with his hat tipped forward. Up front, the engine breathes and pulls. The firebox brightens and dims. Rods flash and disappear. Mile by mile, the cars cross a country that feels a little smaller and a little kinder because people can find one another more easily. Let the story settle there. The rails hold the day's warmth and will cool by morning. The telegraph wire hums in the night like a thin song. Somewhere a section hand hangs his lantern on a nail and lines up his tools for dawn. Somewhere a station agent writes the last entry in a ledger and slides it closed. Somewhere a family, new to a far-off town, hears a whistle and smiles, knowing that milk will arrive cold, letters will arrive soon, and journeys once counted in seasons can now be counted in days. Under a wide sky, a path has been laid firm enough to carry the weight of hope.